The night had started like any other Tuesday in the household. Emma lay in her bedroom on Maple Street in suburban Denver, surrounded by the comfortable chaos of an 11-year-old sanctuary. Glow-in-the-dark stars adorned her ceiling, their faint luminescence casting a soft, ethereal light across her room. Her walls were decorated with posters of her favorite musicians, dog breed charts, and a massive bulletin board covered with photographs from school, birthday parties, and camping trips with her parents. The air conditioning hummed softly, a gentle white noise that typically lulled her to sleep within minutes of her head hitting the pillow. Emma had been asleep for exactly 47 minutes when the first sound jolted her awake. It wasn't loud, not at first. It was more like a vibration, a discordant note that didn't belong in the symphony of nighttime sound she'd grown accustomed to. She stirred slightly, her brain not fully registering that something was wrong. Her eyes fluttered open in the darkness, but she didn't move. She simply lay there, listening, waiting to confirm whether the sound had been real or just part of a dream slipping away. Then came the voices. "Hey, what the hell are you doing?" The shout pierced the quiet night like a shard of glass. It was aggressive, accusatory, and terrifyingly real. Emma's entire body went rigid. She sat up slowly in bed, her 8th-grade textbooks and homework scattered across her desk suddenly meaningless. The voice belonged to her neighbor, Mr., whose house was directly across the street. She recognized his gravelly tone immediately. She'd heard him call her parents home countless times, asking to borrow tools or complaining about yard maintenance. "I don't want any trouble," another voice responded, this one lower and strained, desperate in a way that made Emma's skin prickle with goosebumps. She didn't recognize this voice. It belonged to a stranger, and something about it, the urgency, the fear masked by false bravado, told her that trouble was already here, whether Mr. wanted it or not. Emma threw her covers aside and scrambled out of bed, her feet hitting the cold hardwood floor. She was wearing her favorite pajamas, the ones with tiny wolves printed all over them, and her heart was hammering so violently she thought it might burst through her chest. She crept toward her bedroom window, each step careful and deliberate, as if moving slowly would somehow protect her from whatever was happening outside. The window faced the street, and the view was partially obscured by the lace curtains her mother had hung to let in morning light while maintaining privacy. Emma pushed the fabric aside gently, barely breathing, and peered out into the darkness of Maple Street. The streetlight 3 houses down cast everything in an eerie amber glow, creating exaggerated shadows and pools of impenetrable black. At first, she couldn't make out much. Just 2 silhouettes, their forms overlapping and separating as they struggled against each other. Her eyes adjusted gradually, and the scene became clearer. 2 men were fighting on the sidewalk in front of Mr.'s house. Mr. was older, probably in his 60s, but he was fighting with the desperation of someone who believed his life was in danger. The other man was younger, broader, and he was clearly the aggressor. Their shadows danced against Mr.'s garage wall like grotesque puppets in a nightmare play. "Stop, stop it! Someone help!" Mr.'s cry was raw, vulnerable in a way that transformed him from just the neighbor into a person in genuine peril. This wasn't a verbal argument or a pushing match between drunk neighbors. This was violence. Real, desperate, frightening violence. Emma's hands trembled against the window frame. Every instinct screamed at her to run to her parents' room, to wake them up and let them handle this. But her feet seemed frozen in place, her eyes locked on the unfolding horror outside. She watched as the younger man landed a punch to Mr.'s midsection, watched as Mr. stumbled backward, watched as the attacker raised his fist again. That's when Emma's paralysis finally broke. Her training kicked in, the active shooter drills they'd practiced at school, the stranger danger lessons from elementary school, and most importantly, her parents' constant reminders. If you ever see something wrong, if you ever feel unsafe or witness someone in danger, call 911 immediately. Don't hesitate. Don't wait. Call 911. Emma sprinted from her bedroom, her bare feet slapping against the hardwood floor. She ran to her parents' room and burst through the door, gasping out words that woke them from their sound sleep. "There's someone fighting outside. Mister, someone's hurting him." Her father was out of bed instantly, heading for the window, while her mother immediately grabbed her phone from the nightstand. Emma heard her mother's voice, steady but urgent, as she dialed 911. The call connected, and her mother began explaining the situation to the dispatcher while Emma's father peered out at the street below. "There's definitely something happening," he confirmed, already moving toward the door to go outside. But Emma wasn't done. As her mother explained the situation to the dispatcher, Emma was already racing back to her own room, phone in hand. The dispatcher asked to speak with Emma directly. She was the one who'd witnessed it first, after all. With her mother's permission, Emma took the phone, her voice shaking as she described what she'd seen. "There's two men," she said, her words tumbling out in a rush. "One is older and one is younger. The younger one is. He's hitting him. They're fighting really bad. I don't know what they look like. It's dark. I can't see their faces very good. The older one is Mister. He lives across the street. The other one, I don't know him. I've never seen him before." The dispatcher was calm and professional, asking her specific questions while simultaneously dispatching police officers to Maple Street. "Can you describe the younger man?" the dispatcher asked. Emma tried desperately to focus, to remember details, but fear was clouding everything. Her mind couldn't quite capture specifics. Height, she wasn't sure. Build, muscular maybe. Clothes, dark-colored, but she couldn't be certain of the exact shade. Within 3 minutes, though it felt like hours, the first police cruiser pulled onto Maple Street, its sirens screaming through the quiet suburban night. The red and blue lights flooded the neighborhood, bathing everything in an otherworldly glow. Emma watched from her window as officers emerged from their vehicles, as the younger man suddenly looked up and made a split-second decision that would alter the entire course of events to come. He ran. He bolted from the scene, disappearing into the darkness between the houses on the east side of the street. One of the officers began pursuing him while others attended to Mister, who was bleeding from his lip and cradling his ribs. Emma watched it all unfold like a scene from a television show, except this was real. This was happening on her street in her neighborhood to someone she saw regularly. As the police lights continued to flash and neighbors began emerging from their homes in confusion, Emma realized that her calm phone call had set something in motion. Something big. Something that wouldn't simply disappear when the sun came up in the morning. She had no idea how profoundly this night would change everything. Detective Sarah had been working homicide and violent crime for 12 years, and she'd learned long ago that the first 48 hours of any investigation were absolutely critical. That's why she was already awake at 5:47 a.m. on Wednesday morning, reviewing the incident report from the previous night's assault on Maple Street. The coffee in her mug had gone cold an hour ago, but she didn't notice. Her entire focus was concentrated on the details, or rather, the lack thereof. The assault had occurred at approximately 11:23 p.m. The victim, Robert, 73 years old, suffered bruised ribs, a split lip, and considerable psychological trauma. The attacker had fled the scene before police arrived, leaving behind only questions and uncertainty. The only real witness was an 11-year-old girl named Emma, who had shown impressive courage in calling 911, but whose account was frustratingly vague. Picked up the initial police report again, reading through officers' notes from his first responder interview with Emma. The girl had been standing on her front porch when arrived, wrapped in her mother's robe despite the warm night, her eyes still wide with shock. Had been gentle with her, professional, but even his experienced eye could see that Emma was struggling to process what she'd witnessed. Dark clothes, had written. Approximately 6 feet tall maybe, could be brown hair or dark, Caucasian male, possibly in his 30s, could be younger. Knew that possibly, maybe, and could be, were the death knells of a prosecution case. These words gave defense attorneys exactly what they needed, room for reasonable doubt the size of Colorado. By 8:00 a.m. Wednesday morning, was sitting in the police station's interview room with Emma and her parents, and Michael. The room was deliberately designed to be less intimidating than a typical interrogation space: soft lighting, comfortable chairs, and a small table rather than the harsh metal surfaces of other rooms. Had specifically requested this setting. She'd learned that children responded better to a gentler environment, and their recall was often more accurate when they felt safe. Emma sat between her parents, her small frame dwarfed by the adult-sized chair she occupied. She was wearing her school uniform, navy blue jumper and white blouse, though it was Saturday. Recognized this immediately for what it was: her parents trying to normalize the situation for her, making it feel routine rather than traumatic. "Hi, Emma," said gently, settling into her own chair with her notebook open. She deliberately left her phone outside the room, no distractions, nothing that would suggest this little girl wasn't her complete focus. "I know this is scary, but I want to ask you some questions about what happened last night. Your parents are right here with you, and you can take as much time as you need to answer. Is that okay?" Emma nodded silently, her eyes darting between and her mother nervously. "Let's start with something simple," continued. "Tell me what you were doing before you heard the fighting outside." Emma took a shaky breath. "I was sleeping. I went to bed around 10 o'clock. I was reading for a few minutes and then I turned off my light." "What were you reading?" asked. "A book about dogs. I want to be a veterinarian." Good thought. Establishing normalcy, letting Emma talk about something that didn't terrify her. Over the next hour, walked Emma through the entire sequence of events. The girl's recollections were fragmented and often contradictory. When asked to describe the man's height, she said, "taller than my dad." But then 15 minutes later, when describing him relative to Mr., she said, "maybe the same height." Her descriptions of his clothing shifted slightly each time she described them: definitely dark, became black, or maybe very dark blue, which then became darker than my jacket, but I can't tell if it was black. Heart sank slightly with each inconsistency. She knew Emma wasn't lying. The girl was clearly trying her best, but this was the problem with child witnesses. Their brains genuinely didn't categorize and store information the same way adult brains did. Emma's fear and trauma had further scrambled her memories, creating gaps and distortions that were absolutely real from her perspective, but that a skilled defense attorney could eviscerate in court. "Do you think you would recognize his face if you saw it again?" asked carefully. Emma hesitated for a long moment. I'm not sure. It was dark and I was scared. His face was just a face. I remember he looked angry, really angry, but I can't really remember what he looked like exactly." Wrote this down, knowing that these words were the opening that defense attorneys would drive a truck through. By noon, the interview was finished. Emma's parents took her home and sat alone in her car in the parking lot, phone to her ear as she called James Harrison, the prosecutor assigned to the case. "We have a problem," she told him without preamble. "The only witness is a traumatized child whose recollection is vague and internally inconsistent. We don't have a solid physical description, no license plate from a vehicle, no weapon, and no obvious motive. Neighbors didn't see anything. We've got nothing to work with except the fact that something definitely happened." "What about the K-9 unit from the initial search?" Harrison asked. "They lost the track about 4 blocks away," replied. "Urban environment, too many conflicting scents. We've been checking surveillance cameras in the area, but most of them are pointed at business entrances, not streets. We're trying to piece it together, but it's slow." Over the following days, became increasingly frustrated. She interviewed Mr. multiple times, but even he, the actual victim, couldn't provide a clear identification. "Everything happened so fast," he kept saying. "I was just defending myself. I never got a good look at him." Expanded the investigation, reviewing camera footage from several surrounding blocks, checking crime databases for similar assault patterns, looking for any connection between and the attacker. Nothing emerged. The assault seemed random, senseless, unmotivated. By Friday of that week, sat at her desk staring at a case file that was startlingly thin. She had a crime, she had a victim, she had a witness, but none of it added up to anything prosecutable. Without either a clear identification or additional evidence, the case would likely stall. She'd seen it happen before, promising investigations that went nowhere because the crucial piece of evidence never materialized. She looked at the formal interview transcripts, reading through Emma's words again. The girl had tried so hard to help. She'd been brave and honest and done exactly what she was supposed to do. But sometimes, bravery and honesty weren't enough. The investigation had stalled before it had barely begun. And somewhere out there, the man who'd attacked Robert was probably feeling relieved that he'd gotten away cleanly, never imagining that his escape route and the specific circumstances of his flight would eventually become the thread that would unravel his entire crime. But that revelation was still weeks away. For now, Detective had only questions and frustratingly few answers. Office occupied the entire top floor of a gleaming downtown Denver building, with floor-to-ceiling windows that afforded him a panoramic view of the Rocky Mountains in the distance. It was the kind of view that reminded him daily of his success. He was one of Colorado's most prominent criminal defense attorneys, with a conviction prevention rate that would make any prosecutor weep. His walls were covered with framed newspaper clippings detailing his most spectacular acquittals, and his client list read like a who's who of Colorado's most controversial cases. The file on his mahogany desk was thin, almost pathetically so. The prosecution was moving forward with charges against Michaels, accused of aggravated assault on Robert. Had received the discovery package just that morning, and he was already certain that this case would be his easiest win in years. He read through the police reports methodically, his sharp eyes catching every detail, every inconsistency, every weakness. By the time reached the interview transcripts from Emma, he was smiling. Not a pleasant smile, a predatory one. He pulled up the first interview conducted by officer on the night of the incident, just hours after the assault. He read Emma's initial description. Dark clothes, approximately 6 feet tall maybe, could be brown hair or dark, Caucasian male, possibly in his 30s, could be younger. Then he pulled up the second interview conducted by detective the following morning, spread these documents side by side on his desk, his fingers tracing across the key phrases. In this interview, Emma's description had shifted noticeably. She was now not sure about the height. She described his hair as dark, maybe black, rather than possibly brown, or she said he was definitely muscular when she hadn't mentioned that before. And his age, which she'd initially pegged as possibly in his 30s, was now described as maybe in his 20s or 30s, I'm not sure. Opened his notebook and began writing detailed observations. This was the foundation of his defense strategy, and it was gold. He continued reading. The third interview, this one conducted 2 days later by a different detective attempting to refresh Emma's recollection, contained yet more variations. Now she described his clothing as black or very dark blue instead of just dark. She mentioned that he might have had reddish skin from anger or exertion, a detail she hadn't mentioned in either of the previous interviews. She also noted that his voice was deeper, like an adult man, when asked to differentiate him from younger men. Reclined in his leather chair, steepling his fingers beneath his chin. This was textbook contaminated witness testimony. This was exactly what happened when anxious detectives repeatedly interviewed frightened children, subtly suggesting details that the child's brain would then incorporate into subsequent recollections. It was called false memory implantation, and it was one of his favorite prosecution vulnerabilities to exploit. He called his private investigator, Dale, and told him to get detailed information on Detective Sarah. Within 2 hours had provided with his file, 12 years on the force, 3 commendations, known for being meticulous and by the book. That actually made her more dangerous. A jury would respect her. but it also meant that could argue she was aggressive in her questioning, that she'd led the witness, that her repeated interviews had contaminated Emma's memory. Opened his laptop and began researching similar cases. He pulled up the Anderson case from Virginia, where a child witness's inconsistent identifications had resulted in an innocent man spending years in prison before DNA evidence exonerated him. He found the Martinez case in California, where a child's evolving testimony had been revealed during cross-examination to contain multiple variations and inconsistencies. He compiled a comprehensive research document on how child memories worked, pulling quotes from peer-reviewed studies showing that children's brains stored trauma differently than adults, that repeated questioning could contaminate memories, and that fear significantly impaired a child's ability to form accurate visual memories. By late afternoon, had constructed his entire defense strategy in meticulous detail. He wouldn't claim his client was innocent. That would be unnecessary. Instead, he would methodically dismantle the prosecution's case by destroying the credibility of their only meaningful witness. He would show that Emma's descriptions had changed multiple times. He would demonstrate that repeated police questioning had contaminated her memory. He would emphasize her own admission that she couldn't clearly see the attacker's face in the darkness. And most importantly, he would remind the jury that possibly, maybe, and I'm not sure, were not the foundations upon which reasonable convictions could be built. Picked up his phone and called the district attorney's office, asking to speak with James Harrison. When Harrison came on the line, his voice was smooth and confident. "Mr. Harrison, I wanted to reach out personally regarding the Michaels case. I've reviewed the discovery materials, and I think we should have a conversation about whether the prosecution is really ready to proceed with such a thin case." "What are you talking about?" Harrison replied, though there was an edge of defensiveness in his voice. "We have a solid witness." "Do we?" asked smoothly. "I have 3 separate interviews with your witness, and in each one her descriptions are materially different. She's given 3 different ages for my client, changed her descriptions of his clothing, added details in later interviews that she never mentioned initially. As a former prosecutor, which I was for 4 years, in case you forgot, you know exactly what a competent defense attorney can do with those kinds of inconsistencies." There was silence on the line. "I'm going to ask you something professionally from one attorney to another," continued. "Is this really the case you want to take to trial? A conviction based entirely on the testimony of an 11-year-old child whose memory has been contaminated by repeated police interviews and whose descriptions have shifted with each interview." Harrison's voice was tight. "We'll see you in court." Hung up the phone smiling. He knew that Harrison was now worried. The seed of doubt had been planted, but more importantly, had identified exactly what he needed to do. When this case went to trial, he would systematically destroy Emma's credibility. He would present her inconsistencies to the jury in a way that would make them wonder if she'd actually witnessed what she claimed to witness. He would put detective on the stand and cross-examine her about her interviewing techniques. He would bring in expert witnesses to testify about how child memory could be contaminated and corrupted. And most crucially, he would ensure that reasonable doubt blossomed in the jury's mind like a dark flower. Walked to the window of his office and looked out at the mountains in the distance. From up here, everything looked simple and clear, but that wasn't how the world really worked. In its world, perspective mattered, context mattered, and the slightest inconsistency could be into reasonable doubt if you knew how to present it. He had won dozens of cases using precisely this strategy, and Michaels would be his next victory. The little girl's testimony, no matter how brave or well-intentioned, would be dismantled piece by piece until nothing remained but questions. Didn't know yet that he was about to encounter the one thing his strategy hadn't accounted for. A detail so specific, so sensory, and so beyond question that it would render all of his careful plans obsolete. But that revelation was still weeks away. For now was supremely confident. He'd already won this case, He just didn't know it yet. The courtroom was simultaneously enormous and suffocating. Emma sat in the gallery with her parents on the morning of Monday, June 14th, waiting to be called to testify. She wore a simple navy blue dress that her mother had picked out specifically to make her look innocent and credible, not too formal, not too casual. Her hair was pulled back in a neat braid, and her hands trembled as she gripped her mother's hand. The courtroom itself was intimidating in ways that Emma's 12 years of life had not prepared her for. High ceilings soared above them like a cathedral dedicated to justice. The walls were wood-paneled, giving the space a sense of gravitas and permanence. The judge's bench sat elevated at the front of the room, emphasizing the power differential inherent in the space. The jury box contained 12 ordinary-looking people: farmers, teachers, engineers, a nurse, a retired postal worker. Who would decide whether Michaels had committed assault or whether the prosecution's entire case was built on quicksand? Michaels sat at the defense table in an expensive suit that couldn't quite hide the roughness of his features. He was in his late 20s with dark hair and a muscular build. To Emma, seeing him in person for the first time since that terrifying night, he looked simultaneously familiar and foreign. Could that be the man who'd attacked Mr.? She thought so, but she wasn't certain, and that uncertainty made her stomach turn. "The prosecution calls Emma," the bailiff announced, his voice booming through the courtroom in a way that made Emma jump slightly. She stood on wobbly legs and walked toward the witness stand, acutely aware of every eye in the courtroom tracking her progress. The bailiff was kind, gently helping her climb the steps to the elevated chair. She took the oath, her hand on the Bible, her voice quiet as she swore to tell the truth. James Harrison, the prosecutor, approached her with the demeanor of a kind uncle rather than a lawyer. He wore a navy suit and an expression of genuine warmth. This was deliberate. He needed the jury to see him protecting this child, guiding her gently through her testimony rather than bullying her. "Emma, can you tell me what you were doing on the evening of May 23rd? Harrison asked, his voice gentle and encouraging. Emma took a breath and began to talk. Her voice was small at first, barely audible beyond the third row of seats, but as she continued, it grew steadier. She described going to bed around 10 p.m. She described waking to sounds outside her window. She described the fear that had seized her, the way her heart had pounded, the way the darkness had seemed to swallow everything. "What did you hear?" Harrison prompted. "Shouting," Emma said. "Two men. One was yelling at the other, angry yelling, really angry." "Did you recognize one of those voices?" "The older man was my neighbor, mister, the other voice. I didn't know him. I've never heard him before." Harrison walked her through the sequence of events methodically, letting her tell her story in her own words while gently guiding her when she seemed to lose her thread. He was strategic. He didn't ask her for specific descriptions of the attacker yet. Instead, he built the emotional foundation of her testimony, establishing that something violent and real had occurred, that she had witnessed it, that she had been frightened enough to call 911. The jury was completely engaged. Emma could feel their attention like a physical force. Some of them looked sympathetic. The woman in the third seat of the jury box, who Emma later learned was a teacher, watched her with an expression of genuine concern. Others looked skeptical but attentive, trying to assess her credibility. "Emma, after you called 911, what happened?" Harrison asked. "The police came really fast. There were lights and sirens. The man who was fighting with he ran away. He ran into the dark between the houses. One of the police officers went after him, but I don't think they caught him." "Have you seen this man again since that night?" Emma's eyes flickered toward the defense table, toward Michaels. Maybe, I'm not sure." "What does that mean?" Harrison asked, his voice still gentle but his words carefully chosen. "I mean, he looks kind of like the man I saw, but it was dark that night. I couldn't see his face very well, and I've looked at pictures of him and I think it was him, but I'm not completely sure." This was the critical moment. A defense attorney would take this hesitation and weaponize it, but Harrison was steering the jury in the right direction. He asked Emma to describe the man she'd seen that night, his approximate height, his build, his clothing. Emma gave her answers, and while they were somewhat vague, they were generally consistent with Michael's appearance. "Emma, do you have any doubt in your mind that you saw someone attacking Mr. that night?" Harrison asked. "No," Emma said firmly. "That definitely happened. I definitely saw that." "And that attack was violent and serious, correct?" "Yes, Mr. was really scared. The man was hurting him." Harrison walked back to the prosecution table and sat down, satisfied. He'd established the foundation of his case. Something real happened. Emma witnessed it. It was serious, and her best recollection was that Michaels was the attacker. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough to go to a jury. Then rose from his chair. Emma's stomach dropped. Was even more imposing than she'd imagined. He was tall, probably 6'2", and he wore his expensive suit like armor. His expression was neutral but with an undercurrent of something predatory. He approached the witness stand with the measured pace of someone who had cross-examined hundreds of witnesses and destroyed the credibility of many. "Ms." he began, and Emma noticed that he used her formal title rather than her first name, creating distance between them. "You've today that it was dark when you witnessed this alleged assault. Is that correct?" "Yes," Emma said quietly. "And you were frightened, correct?" "Yes." "So you weren't in the ideal state of mind to carefully observe and remember details, were you?" Emma didn't answer immediately. She could see where this was going. "I was scared," she said, "but I saw what I saw." Smiled thinly. "Did you? Because I've read the police reports, Emma, and I noticed something interesting. Your description of the assailant has changed multiple times. In your first interview, you said he was approximately 6 feet tall. In your second interview, you weren't sure about his height. In your third interview, you said he might have been muscular. Didn't these details change?" Emma felt her face flush red. She looked at her parents in the gallery, then back at. "I was trying to remember," she said. "Sometimes when you try to remember things, more details come back." Or, said smoothly, "Sometimes repeated questioning implants false memories. Isn't that possible?" The jury was watching her carefully now, and Emma could see the skepticism blooming on several faces. She had come to court to help put away someone who'd committed a crime, and instead she felt like she was being attacked, like her word was being questioned, like she was the one on trial. Behind her, Detective watched from the gallery, her jaw clenched. She knew what was about to happen. The entire case was about to be torn apart. And it was all going to turn on something no one had anticipated yet. Cross-examination began gently but quickly escalated into something far more aggressive. He paced back and forth in front of the witness stand like a predator circling wounded prey, his voice never raising above conversational volume, but carrying a weight of accusation with every word. "Emma, let me establish some facts," began, his tone almost friendly. "It was nighttime when you witnessed this alleged assault, correct?" "Yes," Emma answered quietly. "And nighttime means it was dark. There were shadows, reduced visibility, correct?" "There was a streetlight," Emma offered defensively. "I could see some things." "Could you see clearly? Let's say you were looking out your window at someone 30 feet away in mixed light and shadow. Could you see their face with perfect clarity?" "Not perfect," Emma admitted, "but I could see." "So not perfectly," interrupted. "Thank you for that admission. Now, in your statement to officer on the night of the incident, you said the man had possibly brown hair or dark hair. Do you remember saying that?" Emma hesitated. I'm not sure." "It's in the police report," said, holding up the document. "Officer specifically wrote that you said the suspect could have brown hair or dark hair. Now, in your interview with Detective the next morning, you said he had dark hair, maybe black. Those are significantly different descriptions, aren't they?" "I was trying to remember," Emma said, her voice becoming smaller. "Were you remembering, or were you being influenced by detectives' questioning?" asked sharply. "Tell me, did detectives suggest that the suspect had dark hair before you gave that answer?" "I don't remember," Emma whispered. "Let me read from the transcript," said, flipping through pages deliberately. "Detective asked you what color was his hair, and you responded, 'I'm not sure, dark maybe.' And then detective said, 'Darker than your hair.' And then you said, 'Yeah, definitely darker, maybe black.' So detective was leading you toward the conclusion that he had dark hair, wasn't she?" Emma's eyes filled with tears. She looked at her mother in the gallery, then back at, I wasn't trying to." "You also said in your first interview that he was approximately 6 feet tall, maybe. But in your second interview you said you weren't sure about his height. How do you explain that change?" "I was trying to be more honest," Emma said. "I realized I wasn't certain." Orr said, "You were becoming increasingly uncertain as the reality set in that you didn't actually get a good look at this man's face or body. Isn't that what was really happening?" The prosecutor rose to his feet. "Your Honor, the witness is a child. Mr. is clearly intimidating her." The judge, the Honorable Westbrook, a woman in her mid-60s with a stern demeanor, looked at over her reading glasses. "Mr., I'll allow vigorous cross-examination, but temper your approach slightly. This is a child witness." Nodded respectfully to the judge, then turned back to Emma with what might have been a smile if it weren't so clearly predatory. "Emma, I apologize if I'm being too intense. I just want to make sure the jury understands the facts. Now, you've also that the suspect was wearing dark clothing. In your first interview, you said dark clothes. In your second interview, you said black or very dark blue. How many times would you estimate you were interviewed about the color of his clothing?" "I don't know," Emma said miserably. "Maybe 3 times." "3 times," repeated. "And each time, your certainty about the details decreased while your descriptions somehow became more specific. That's interesting, isn't it? Most people, if they witness something traumatic, would have more detail retained over time, not less. Your memory seems to be working in the opposite direction." Emma was crying now. Her whole body trembled in the witness chair. The jury was watching her with increasing doubt. The woman who looked like a teacher was now frowning, no longer looking sympathetic. The farmer in the back row was shaking his head slightly. "Emma," continued, his voice calculated to sound reasonable rather than cruel, "of all the things you've about today, the one thing you've been most consistent about is that you couldn't clearly see this man's face. Isn't that accurate?" "Yes," Emma sobbed. "It was dark, I was scared." "So you cannot, with any certainty, identify the man sitting at this table as the person who assaulted Mr. Can you?" "I think, maybe, he looks like." Emma's voice trailed off into incoherent sobbing. Stood up from her seat in the gallery, ready to go to her daughter, but Michael held her back, knowing that any disturbance would only hurt Emma's case further. Waited for the crying to subside, and his patience was almost more frightening than his aggression had been. He was giving the jury time to absorb the collapse of the prosecution's only witness. "Let me ask you directly," said. "If I told you that this man, Michaels, had never been near Maple Street on the night of May 23rd, if I told you that he has an alibi that places him in another part of the city, would that surprise you, given that you cannot clearly identify him?" "Objection," the prosecutor shouted, argumentative and assumes facts not in evidence. "Sustained," Judge Westbrook said. "Mr. Move on." But the damage was done. The jury understood exactly what was implying, that Emma's uncertain identification combined with an alibi would make the case disappear. Several jurors were now looking at Michaels with less certainty of his guilt. Emma sat in the witness chair, tears streaming down her face, her small frame collapsed in on itself. She felt like she'd let everyone down, Mr., the police, the jury, her parents. She tried so hard to help, and instead she'd been systematically dismantled by a skilled attorney who made her doubt her own memories. Returned to his table and sat down, satisfied. From his perspective, the trial was over. The prosecution's case had been destroyed by an 11-year-old girl who couldn't keep her story straight. The jury would acquit Michaels, and the justice system would have failed once again to convict someone who'd committed a crime. Judge Westbrook looked at the prosecutor. Any redirect examination? James Harrison stood up, looking pale. Yes, Your Honor. Emma, I just have a few questions. You witnessed a violent assault, correct? Yes, Emma whispered. And you called 911 immediately because you knew something wrong was happening, correct? Yes. And you were honest in all of your interviews with the police, even when you weren't sure about details. Yes. But it was too late. The jury's doubt had taken root, and no amount of rehabilitation could remove it now. As Emma stepped down from the witness stand, she felt like she'd failed everyone who had counted on her. She had no idea that the most important moment of the entire trial was still to come, a moment that would turn everything on its head in a way that no one had anticipated. She just knew that she'd let them all down. Emma sat in the witness chair, emotionally devastated and convinced that her testimony had been a complete disaster. She'd stepped down, walked back to sit with her parents, and spent the next 15 minutes staring at her hands while her mother rubbed her back gently. The trial continued around her, other witnesses, evidence was presented, the attorneys made their arguments. Emma felt numb, disconnected from it all. It was nearly 4 o'clock in the afternoon when Judge Westbrook announced that the prosecution had additional evidence to present. James Harrison stood and announced that he wished to show the jury photograph identification boards, pictures from the police database that might help establish whether any known associates of Michaels had committed similar assaults in the area. The witness may be excused, Judge Westbrook said, turning to Emma, but raised her hand. Your Honor, my daughter would like to remain in the courtroom. We feel it's important for her to see the process through. The judge considered this, then nodded. You may remain, but you'll need to sit in the back, away from the prosecution and defense tables. The jury should not see you coaching your daughter. Emma and her parents moved to the back row of the gallery, settling into seats that gave them a clear view of the proceedings. Emma's father held her hand tightly, silently communicating that he was proud of her despite how she felt about her performance. Harrison approached the jury with the photograph boards, large poster-sized displays containing 6 each. He explained that these were individuals with records of assault or violence in the Denver area, individuals that the police had considered as potential suspects. As the prosecutor laid out the boards, describing each person and their criminal history, Emma watched listlessly. Then Harrison positioned the second board directly in front of the jury box, and as he did, the K9 unit, a beautiful German shepherd named Victor who had been used in the initial search of the crime scene, stood up from where he'd been lying near the back of the courtroom. The dog had been brought to court as evidence of the tracking techniques used, and he'd been sitting quietly throughout most of the proceedings. The moment Emma saw Victor stand up, something shifted in her brain. The dog's movement triggered a cascade of memories that she hadn't been able to access until that precise moment. She suddenly remembered the K9 unit from that night, remembered seeing the police officer with the dog, remembered the frantic barking as the dog tried to follow a scent trail, remembered seeing something else in that memory. The suspect's panicked face as he realized there was a dog tracking him. He ran, Emma suddenly whispered. No one heard her. She spoke so quietly that her words were swallowed by the general courtroom noise. But then Emma stood up, her small frame rising from her seat in the back of the courtroom. She pointed directly at Victor, the K9 unit, her voice suddenly louder and clearer than it had been all day. He ran, she shouted. He ran from the dog. The entire courtroom froze. Judge Westbrook's gavel stopped mid-strike. The jury members turned to look at the back of the courtroom where Emma stood, pointing at Victor. His head whipped around, his expression transforming from confident satisfaction to confusion. James Harrison stood stock still, trying to comprehend what was happening. Emma's parents stood up beside her, confused but supportive. Her mother put a hand on her shoulder. "Young lady," Judge Westbrook said sharply, "you cannot testify from the gallery. Sit down immediately." But the damage, or rather the breakthrough, had already occurred. Everyone in the courtroom understood exactly what Emma had meant. She wasn't saying she could identify the man from the photographs. She was saying that she remembered the suspect running away from the K-9 unit. That specific, sensory detail, the panic of a man fleeing from a police dog, was a memory so vivid and authentic that it gave her entire account credibility in a way that uncertain face identification never could. The prosecutor's eyes widened with realization. This was it. This was the detail that could unlock everything. Detective, sitting in the gallery near the back, suddenly sat up straight. She understood immediately what Emma had just revealed. The K-9 tracking data, the direction the dog had gone. She could cross-reference that with surveillance footage from that specific direction. Judge Westbrook gavelled sharply. "We will take a 15-minute recess. Ms., you will return to the witness stand after this break for further questioning regarding this revelation." The courtroom erupted into controlled chaos. Attorneys huddled with their associates. Jurors whispered to each other despite the judge's instructions not to discuss the case. Emma's parents embraced their daughter, suddenly understanding that something profound had just happened. His face had gone pale. He sat at his table, staring at nothing, his carefully constructed defense strategy suddenly in ruins. That simple phrase he ran had fundamentally altered everything. It was a detail that he couldn't attack as memory contamination because it was based on a sensory experience, not on visual identification. People running, fleeing, panicking. These were visceral memories that the brain encoded differently than facial features or clothing colors. Pulled Emma close and whispered, "What do you remember, sweetie? Tell us everything." Emma's words tumbled out in a rush. "When the police came with the dog, I remember seeing the man's face when he saw the dog. He looked really scared. Really, really scared. He wasn't expecting the dog. He ran so fast, just ran away from it. I remember that so clearly now. I didn't remember it before because I was so scared of what was happening with Mr. But when I saw that dog just now, it all came back." Detective was already on her phone, calling her office. "Pull the K-9 tracking records from May 23rd. Get me exact coordinates for where the dog lost the scent. And pull all surveillance footage from businesses in the direction the dog was tracking. I need this now." The prosecutor was conferring with his team, all of them speaking in urgent, hushed tones. They understood that Emma's testimony had just been transformed from a liability into an asset. Her uncertain visual identification didn't matter anymore. What mattered was that the suspect had panicked when he saw the police dog, had fled in a specific direction, and that direction could potentially be corroborated with objective evidence. After the recess, Emma returned to the witness stand. The prosecutor approached her with careful questions, asking her to describe in detail what she remembered about the suspect's reaction to the K-9 unit. Emma described it with crystalline clarity, the shock on his face, the way he'd immediately bolted, the direction he'd run. Her voice was steady now, no longer uncertain. This wasn't about identifying a face in darkness. This was about describing a moment of human panic that she had witnessed, and that had burned itself into her traumatized mind. Cross-examined her again, but his earlier aggressive confidence was completely gone. He tried to suggest that she was confabulating, that seeing the dog now had implanted a false memory of seeing a dog that night. But the jury didn't believe him. They could see in Emma's face that this memory was different, more authentic, more visceral, more real than the uncertain facial descriptions she'd given before. By the end of the day, as the court adjourned, everyone understood that the case had fundamentally changed. What had seemed like a prosecution disaster had transformed, in a single moment of clarity, into something entirely different. Two words had altered the trajectory of justice. He ran. Detective Sarah didn't wait for the courtroom recess to end. She was already on her phone in the hallway outside the courtroom, calling Officer Tom Bradley, who managed the K-9 unit records. Her voice was tight with urgency, her mind racing through the possibilities that Emma's simple statement had opened up. "Tom, I need the tracking records from May 23rd. The initial response to Maple Street. Where exactly did Victor lose the scent?" There was a pause as Bradley retrieved the information. Could hear the rustling of files, the clicking of a keyboard. "Coordinates are here," Bradley said. "East 3rd Avenue and Marion Street, about 4 blocks from the initial assault site. Victor tracked him straight there and then lost the scent completely. The urban environment was too contaminated, too many overlapping odors. We assumed the suspect had gotten into a vehicle at that location." His mind snapped the pieces together instantly. 4 blocks east, not west toward the highway, not north toward the industrial district. East, directly in the direction that the city's densest commercial corridor lay. "Tom, there's surveillance camera coverage in that area. Businesses on East 3rd Avenue. I need footage from that night, approximately 11:30 p.m. onwards. Can you pull that?" "I can coordinate with the businesses, but it'll take time. You'll need warrants for some of them." "I'm going to the DA right now," said. "Give me the specific business addresses where the K-9 lost the track." Within 30 minutes, Detective and James Harrison were standing in front of Judge Westbrook's chambers with an emergency warrant application. The judge, intrigued by Emma's courtroom revelation and understanding the critical nature of timing, approved the warrants immediately. By 6 p.m. that evening, the first surveillance footage was being downloaded from a convenience store located directly on East 3rd Avenue, just 6 blocks from where the assault occurred. What the footage revealed was extraordinary. The timestamp showed 11:31 p.m. on May 23rd. A man matching Michael's description came running down the sidewalk in absolute panic. His shirt was torn. His face was flushed. He was looking over his shoulder repeatedly, clearly aware that he was being pursued. He ran past the convenience store, then slowed his pace just slightly, looking around to get his bearings. The camera caught his face clearly in the streetlight, recognizable, distinctive, unmistakable. 30 seconds later, a police officer appeared on the same footage, still in pursuit but falling behind. His heart began to pound. This was it. This was the objective corroboration that Emma's testimony needed. She immediately called James Harrison with the news. "We have video," said without preamble. "Michael's, clearly identifiable, running from police in the exact direction that the K-9 tracked him. Timestamp is consistent with the assault. His appearance is consistent with everything Emma described: panic, running, fleeing." "How clear?" Harrison asked, his voice urgent. "Clear enough for a conviction. His face is visible. There's no question who it is." But that was just the beginning. Over the next 2 hours, a cascade of corroborating evidence emerged as her team pulled all available records related to Michael's on May 23rd. Cell phone records showed that Michael's phone had pinged off towers directly near Maple Street at 11:22 p.m., exactly 1 minute before the assault was called in. His phone had then pinged towers moving east, consistent with the route captured on surveillance camera. Physical evidence that had previously seemed inconclusive suddenly made sense. A fiber found at the scene, dark blue denim, was matched to the jeans Michaels was wearing in the surveillance footage. Blood found on Michael's knuckles matched Robert's DNA. A partial fingerprint found on his jacket, which hadn't yielded results in the initial search, was re-examined and matched to Michael's criminal database fingerprints. But it was the vehicle evidence that closed the case entirely. Security camera footage from a parking garage 2 blocks east of where Michaels had run showed him arriving at his pickup truck at 11:38 p.m., his appearance and distress consistent with someone who just assaulted someone and fled from police. The truck's license plate was captured on footage. That same truck had been registered to Michael's address. Text messages on Michael's phone showed him messaging an associate at 11:47 p.m. Had to leave fast, ran from the cops, will lay low for a few. By 10 p.m. that night, detective had compiled a file of objective evidence so comprehensive and so devastating that it completely validated every aspect of Emma's account. The suspect had been at Maple Street at the time of the assault. He had been wearing the described clothing. He had been muscular and younger, as Emma had estimated. He had panicked and fled when police and the K-9 arrived. He had run in the exact direction that Emma's subconscious mind had registered when she saw the dog in the courtroom. Brought all of this evidence to James Harrison, who sat in stunned silence as he reviewed each piece. This is extraordinary," Harrison finally said. "It's like she unlocked the entire case." "She did more than that," said. "She proved that her testimony was fundamentally honest. Every detail she gave us, even the uncertain ones, turned out to be accurate once we had the framework to understand it. Her memory wasn't contaminated. It was traumatized but not false." The next morning, Michael's confidence collapsed completely when his attorney reviewed the new evidence. The surveillance footage alone was devastating, but combined with cell phone records, physical evidence, DNA, fingerprints, and vehicle evidence, the case had transformed from weak to bulletproof in a single day. Requested an emergency meeting with the prosecution. He sat across from James Harrison, and detective in the DA's office. His earlier predatory confidence completely evaporated. "This is unexpected," said carefully, reviewing the photographs from the surveillance footage. "May I speak with my client?" Within an hour, Michaels had decided to accept a plea agreement. Faced with the overwhelming objective evidence, there was no point in proceeding to trial. He would plead guilty to aggravated assault, recommend a 15-year sentence, and the case would be resolved. The remarkable truth, though it wouldn't become clear until later analysis by criminal justice experts, was that Emma's uncertain testimony about faces and clothing colors had actually been more reliable than anyone realized. Her descriptions had shifted slightly, not because her memory was contaminated, but because she was trying to be accurate despite being traumatized. When faced with the K-9, the most visceral element of her experience that night, her brain had unlocked the authentic sensory memory that corroborated everything else. 2 words he ran had triggered an avalanche of objective evidence that proved the case beyond any possible doubt. Returned to his office and sat at his desk, staring at the photographs of Michaels running in panic from the K-9 unit. He'd been wrong. Completely, comprehensively wrong about the weakness of the case. He'd built an elaborate defense strategy based on the assumption that child memories were unreliable and contaminated, never considering that sometimes children's brains, under trauma, locked onto the most authentic emotional and sensory truths. Emma, 12 years old, had just taught one of Colorado's best criminal defense attorneys a lesson about the complexity of human memory that no law school class ever could have provided. And somewhere across the city, Detective Sarah was celebrating the breakthrough with her team, knowing that justice had prevailed because one little girl had finally found the sensory key that unlocked her authentic memory. Michael stood before Judge Westbrook on a bright morning in July 2024, approximately 6 weeks after Emma had pointed at the K-9 unit and said 2 words that changed everything. He wore an Orange County Jail jumpsuit, his muscular frame diminished by the realization of his consequences. His earlier confidence had evaporated completely, replaced by the hollow resignation of someone facing the reality of a 15-year prison sentence. Judge Westbrook looked at him with the neutral expression she reserved for sentencing hearings. "Mr. Michaels, you have pled guilty to aggravated assault on Robert. The evidence in this case was overwhelming. A young girl, despite her fear and trauma, had the courage to witness a crime and bring it to the attention of authorities. Because of her bravery and her eventual clarity of mind regarding crucial sensory details, justice has been served. Your 15-year sentence reflects the severity of your actions and your responsibility for the trauma you caused to your victim and to the community. Emma sat in the gallery with her parents and Detective Sarah. She wore a blue dress similar to the one she'd worn during trial, and while she was still only 12 years old, she carried herself with a maturity beyond her years. She understood that her testimony, her courage, and ultimately her clarity about the K-9 had resulted in a dangerous criminal receiving a substantial prison sentence. As Michaels was led away, Emma felt something shift inside her, not closure exactly, because trauma doesn't ever fully close, but rather a sense of completion, of having been heard and believed and validated. What happened over the following months and years was unprecedented in Denver's criminal justice system. Emma's case became a teaching moment that rippled far beyond the immediate participants. The first indication of broader interest came 3 weeks after sentencing, when Dr. Thornton, a criminal psychology professor at the University of Colorado, published a detailed analysis of Emma's case in a prominent legal journal. Her article, titled Sensory Memory and Trauma Response, the K-9 Case Study, examined how Emma's brain had prioritized visceral, emotional memories over visual details when processing trauma. Thornton's analysis demonstrated that traumatized children often retained authentic sensory memories, sounds, smells, emotions, physical sensations, even when they struggled to accurately remember visual details. This research contradicted the widespread assumption that child witnesses were inherently unreliable across all types of testimony. The article caught the attention of the National Center for Victims of Crime and the American Bar Association's Criminal Justice Section. Within 2 months, Emma's case was being discussed at professional conferences. Criminal justice professors began using her case as a teaching tool in law schools across the country. Prosecutors started revising their interviewing techniques for child witnesses, focusing on sensory details rather than leading visual identification questions. Detective Sarah became an unexpected advocate herself. She began giving presentations at police training academies about the importance of carefully documenting all witness observations, including sensory details that might seem insignificant in the moment. She spoke at conferences about how her initial frustration with Emma's inconsistencies had blinded her to the possibility that the girl's traumatized brain was accurately encoding different types of information differently. But perhaps most significantly, Emma herself began to find her voice as an advocate. 3 months after the trial concluded, received a call from the director of the Colorado Child Advocacy Center, asking if Emma might be interested in volunteering with an organization that prepared child witnesses for court testimony. The idea terrified Emma at first. The experience of being cross-examined by had been traumatic in its own way, being made to doubt her own memories, having her words twisted against her, feeling like her testimony was failing everyone who needed her. But her mother encouraged her gently. You survived something incredibly hard, and you ended up being the reason justice happened. Other children might feel the same fear you felt. They might need to know that even when it's scary, even when an attorney tries to make them doubt themselves, the truth can still prevail. Emma started volunteering with the organization when she was 13 years old. She would meet with children between 8 and 16 years old who were about to testify in criminal trials. She would tell them her story, not just the courtroom drama, but the fear, the confusion, the way her mind had hidden some details while holding others crystalline clear. Most importantly, she would tell them that it was okay to say, "I don't know," or "I'm not sure." She would explain that the most important thing was to be honest, because honesty could be discovered through unexpected pathways, even through pointing at a police dog and saying 2 words. Years passed. Emma graduated from high school. She went to college at the University of Colorado, where she majored in criminal justice with a focus on victim advocacy. During her senior year, she interned with the DA's office, assisting prosecutors in case preparation, particularly with cases involving young witnesses. She worked closely with Detective Sarah, who had become a lifelong mentor and friend. On a Wednesday in April 2031, 7 years after that terrifying night on Maple Street, Emma stood before an audience of criminal justice professionals at the annual National Prosecutors Conference in Denver. She was now 20 years old, poised and articulate, speaking to an auditorium of over 500 prosecutors, judges, law enforcement officers, and victims' advocates. "I was 11 years old when I witnessed a crime," Emma began, her voice steady and clear. "I was traumatized. I was confused. I couldn't clearly remember the attacker's face. And because of that, I was made to feel like I had failed, like my testimony wasn't good enough, like I wasn't doing my job correctly. But my job wasn't to perfectly remember every detail of a traumatic experience. My job was to be honest about what I did remember. And what I remembered most clearly was not a face, but an emotion, panic. And that memory, combined with careful investigation, led to justice." She described her journey from traumatized witness to advocate. She talked about the children she'd worked with through the Child Advocacy Center, many of whom carried similar trauma and similar doubts about their own memories. She discussed research that had emerged from her case, research that had fundamentally changed how investigators approached child witnesses. "We now understand," Emma told the audience, "that trauma doesn't always corrupt memory. Sometimes it clarifies it. Sometimes a child's brain prioritizes the most important emotional truths over the visual details we traditionally emphasize. We've changed how we interview children. We ask different questions. We listen for sensory details rather than dismissing them as irrelevant. And we've seen conviction rates for crimes against vulnerable victims increase significantly as a result." The auditorium gave her a standing ovation. After her speech, Emma was approached by Dr. Thornton, the criminal psychology professor whose research had begun the national conversation about Emma's case. Thornton had spent the last 7 years continuing her research, building on the foundation that Emma's case had provided. She held a study in her hands, a comprehensive analysis of how changing interview techniques for child witnesses had improved both the accuracy of their testimony and conviction rates in crimes against vulnerable victims. "Your case has changed the system," Thornton told her. "Not just the legal system in Colorado, but criminal justice approaches nationwide. You should be proud." Emma smiled, but there was sadness in it too. She thought about the night that had started everything, the fear, the confusion, the way her mind had fragmented under trauma. She thought about Emma Martinez, a 9-year-old girl from Nebraska whom she'd mentored through the Child Advocacy Center, who had in her own case and received proper validation and support as a result. She thought about the dozens of other children whose experiences had been improved because the justice system had learned from her case. Most of all, she thought about Robert, her elderly neighbor, whose life had been violated by Michael's, had recovered physically, though the trauma persisted. But he'd told Emma and her family many times that having her stand up for him in court, having her find the courage to point at that dog and say those 2 words, had allowed him to begin healing. 2 words had changed everything. And those 2 words had gone on changing things in ways that Emma could never have predicted on that terrifying night when she was just an 11-year-old girl, waking to violence on her street, making a 911 call that would set everything in motion. Justice, Emma had learned, sometimes depends on the smallest voices being heard in the loudest rooms. And sometimes the most important truths are discovered not through what we consciously remember, but through what our traumatized minds instinctively know to be true. As Emma left the conference that day, she thought about how far she'd come from that frightened girl in the witness stand. She thought about the future ahead of her, about the other children she would help, about the continuing evolution of how the justice system treated child witnesses. And she thought about 2 words that had echoed through courtrooms and law schools and criminal justice conferences across the entire nation. He ran. 2 words that changed everything.